I'm going to begin with a confession. Pentecost, for me, has been a day that in my lifetime has kind of snuck up on me from time to time. That is to say, unleavened bread we get ready for. We clean the house, we clean the car, we examine ourselves. And the Feast of Tabernacles, oh boy, we get ready for that too. We make reservations, we register, we make plans to travel at times. But there have been times that Pentecost has kind of snuck up on me, and I was ashamed when that happened. When I look in my older years at every single aspect of what's on the earth today, I find myself in a very negative attitude a lot of the time. I see problems in education, I see problems in government, I see problems in the workplace, problems in the neighborhoods, problems in families. God's holy days have meanings that build upon each other. Together they progressively reveal how God deals and works with humanity. As He leads us to His perfect government, it isn't going to have these problems that I'm inclined to look at today. In other words, how life is going to be. God controls the harvests. And for Pentecost, He tells us to count. Now, we count all the days that God gives us. We count 6 days, and on the seventh day is the Sabbath. But He specifically uses a word here that's a little bit different when it comes to counting. The word is spelled C-A-P-H-A-R, and I believe it's pronounced sophar. And what it means is to count with intensity. To count with intensity, which is just the opposite of what I was doing if I let Pentecost sneak up on me. My title today is Count with Intensity. And my purpose is to consider why God tells us to do this. Why does He do that? Well, I'm going to go over just a few of the ways that God set things up in the beginning. I really don't know if they were ever really done that way, but it gives us a little bit of a foretaste of how it will be. And you don't have to turn to these scriptures. I'll be turning to a few scriptures later, but in Leviticus 25, we read about the land Sabbath. The land was to be worked for 6 years, and then on the seventh year, the people were to let it rest. I don't know if that ever took place, but that was the law that was given. It was given in Leviticus 25. I remember when I was younger, I would work 2 jobs just to make ends meet, and boy, at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles came around, I'd take 2 weeks off, and I really was excited about that. Well, think about taking a whole year off. I remember once we were in a strange hall, and the place was very bright, and one man said, "It's a good thing that God hasn't called everybody today, because if He had, we wouldn't have any electricity to have these lights on. No one would be there to, work the electric plant." And I remember thinking to myself at the time, I think God could have given us some light. But for the whole year, the land was supposed to rest. Our minister was Mitch Knapp when I first read about that, and I asked Mr. Knapp, I said, "Should I rest my garden?" And he said, "Well, we don't exactly know which year we're supposed to do that. Just take good care of the soil." And as I say, I don't know if it was ever observed, but to me it means that these people, if they had followed that, would have a whole year to spend with their family. They'd have a whole year to spend with God and draw closer together as a family, draw closer to God. It'd just be a wonderful thing. God would have provided for them, as He provided manna for Israel on the 6th day when they were in the wilderness. Deuteronomy 15, you don't have to turn there. This is called the year of release. If anybody had a debt, at the end of the 6th year, it was released. They weren't in debt anymore. There were years in my lifetime, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you this, I received as many as 50 credit card applications in the mail. I have to ask, who would profit from that? Who profits from other people going into debt? I suspect that if someone was in debt for whatever reason, that they were happy to get out of debt when that 7th year came around. In Leviticus 25, we read about the year of Jubilee, another way that God's government is going to rule that isn't done today. In the mid-1990s, banks were buying one another out. The big banks were buying the little banks really at a feverish pace. And it got to where some banks were very, very big, other banks were gone. And if there was someone who was behind on their house payments, quite typically, because the big banks, being so big, would have their foreclosure department in only one bank, in only one city. It was called the Loss Mitigation Department. And if you would call the bank where you lived and ask, what can I do? They didn't know. They really didn't know. So they'd give you a two-word answer. They'd say, pay up. I went into the business of foreclosure counseling at that time. And I would go to the courthouse. I'd get names of people who were behind because lawyers would always put their names in there. They'd file cases against them. And I'd send letters to people offering counseling help. I didn't do that for free. But I had no doubt in my mind that God led me to that business because the very first family whose house I saved was named Miracle. That's no baloney. That's really true. That was their name, Mr. and Mrs. Miracle, and their two children. And we saved their house. And they were thrilled. He had lost his job because of health, and now he had his job. He had a different job now. He was healthy again. So we saved their home. We saved their equity. But you know, all we really saved was a place to live. And I'm not making that lighter than it is. That's wonderful. But back when this law was given, it was more than that. If you lost your inheritance, you were losing your employment as well, and you had to sell yourself into slavery. The word for counting to the year of Jubilee, by the way, was also sophar. But I think that people didn't have any trouble being intense when they counted down the days of that powerful time. We are told to count to Pentecost with intensity. You can turn, please, to 1 Peter, first chapter. The International Bible Encyclopedia says that Pentecost was much like our day of Thanksgiving today, and I'm going to edit that just a moment and assume that that was written sometime back. I'm going to say probably it was more like our Thanksgiving was 50 to 60 years ago. Today, I know if we turn on the news, they'll say, oh, next week is Turkey Day. But I remember when I was young, we were very thankful. That was drummed into us, that we should have Thanksgiving. I consider how the people of the day that that commandment was given must have looked forward to Pentecost. The encyclopedia says there was a spirit of cheer among all the people and the Levites. 1 Peter 1 verse 13 says, therefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts as in your ignorance, but he who called you is holy. You also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. And I want to read the next two verses, please, out of the New Revised Standard Version, verse 17. In the New Revised Standard it says, if you invoke as Father the one who judges all people impartially, according to their deeds, live in reverent fear during the time of your exile. And verse 18 says, you know that you were ransomed from the feudal ways inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver and gold, but with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Peter talks of us being sojourners today. We are the spiritual nation of Israel. He also speaks of us being ransomed. We could say we were ransomed now, and the rest will be ransomed at the end of 50 years, it could be said. I have considered recently, and I would ask you to do the same. We read about this in the second chapter of Acts, but there were 120 people at that time, and they were looking forward to the day of Pentecost. Consider as you think about this, what kind of thoughts were going through their mind. How intensely they were counting down to that day of Pentecost. Exodus 15, please. Exodus 15. I suspect that they were highly anticipating what was going to happen. They didn't know. I'm sure they were amazed when they found out. Exodus 15, verse 13, I've always thought of this as Moses' song, says, "You in your mercy have led forth the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them in your strength to your holy habitation." Brethren, this verse tells us what this countdown period is all about. It also tells us where we're going. We now belong to God. He's purchased us with the blood of Jesus Christ. Now, as we look ahead, consider the excitement, the intensity, as it were, that's represented by a future Pentecost when the enormous, overwhelming, true peace and spiritual freedom that it represents is understood totally, and Satan is bound. The process of putting out the sin that has filled our old way of living isn't instantaneous. We need God's Spirit guiding us constantly to become one. The number 50 implies complete freedom from captivity. For us, the captivity of sin. Spiritual maturity is a lifelong process. As of today, we've counted 21 days. We have 29 to go. We should count them with intensity.